Hey everybody, welcome back to Terminus, the moon scars of extreme metal podcasts. I am the death metal guy, aka Uwada-related heatstroke.
And I am the black metal guy, aka Harbinger, I barely know her.
Okay. That's... Before we started, you prefaced with, okay, I got a weird one. It's like, oh, the weird one is just the worst dad joke possible.
Yeah, but it's a very metal dad joke.
It is, because the cool thing is, like, I really love, like, heavy, intense, severe metal, but I'm also, like, a dad, and I've got my own microbrewery. So, you can be a lot of different things.
Yeah, I like heavy, intense, severe music, like Pantera and Stone Temple Pilots.
And Sleep. Yeah, it's loud and crushing.
Uwada-related heat stroke is, I feel like that was kind of the nail in the coffin for that band.
Yeah, it's hard to come back from that. I think that, like, I've never liked them, but it seems like the general estimation of that band has gone down dramatically ever since that incident.
It's true. Everyone stopped talking. Yeah, you don't hear about them anymore, which is nice.
Well, I think they did some, like, other goofy social media shit after that. Just, like, sort of pretentiously sincere shit.
There's a lot of ill-advised boomer posting, yes. Like making the mistake of using social media to express your emotions, which is like
the worst
a mistake we've all made, but had to unlearn by about 2017.
Yeah, and you're, the time for you to do that is between the age of, like, up to about 22, 23. That's about your last gasp. When you're guys in a touring band in your 30s, it doesn't really work out quite as well. Yeah. So, before we get into our episode, quick housekeeping. Follow me, the Death Metal Guy, on Facebook at Terminus Podcast, or the Black Metal Guy on Instagram at Terminus Extreme Metal. You can also feel free to subscribe to us on Patreon, where $5 and up gets you access to the Terminus Prime bonus episodes, as well as the Terminus Black Circle, our private Discord server, where right now we're primarily discussing the new Sam Hyde reality show Fish Tank, and we're all very excited for it.
Yeah, whoa! Terminus unconditionally disavows Sam Hyde and all of his
mass shootings, terrorist acts, various violent crimes, hate crimes, white collar as well as blue collar crimes, every kind of crime. So it's been a little bit, but I actually have a mini review for us today. Dan from Galicia and Warriors Chalice and the 7 other bands that feature all the same members that they have out there in SoCal has started his own little micro label called Bunsen Burner Recordings. And I was just hanging out with those guys the other day, and they mentioned that they had just recently put out a reissue of the demo of a local LA band from 2008. And I was immediately interested, so I decided to give it a listen and feature it on the show. So the first record we're going to discuss tonight is by the band Demonslaught, titled Demonlord. This is an independent original from 2008, and as I said, the reissue is on Bunsen Burner Recordings. So in keeping with the expanding 1.5 wave tradition that we're starting to see, we have another example of it, albeit, sort of unstuck from time. It's really interesting. This is a sort of 1.5 wave thing that a lot of people call black thrash, but also sounds kind of like Nunslaughter or something like that. The biggest reference points, though, are going to be like first few Bathory records, Sabbath from Japan, and I would say like the first EP by Sodom. Those are all going to be pretty essential.
I'm going to take a wild guess and also say Onslaught.
Yeah. So probably everything that you're imagining is going to be a reference point here. But what's interesting is to imagine this in the context of 2008, where I would say this sort of thing was highly unfashionable. This sort of stuff that would have been comfortably slotted alongside something like Abigail was not, doing great at this period. 2008 is, orthodox black metal, still mid-explosion. It's, Bloodos Nord's sort of biggest, most progressive works. It's stuff like that. So there weren't a ton of people doing this sort of scrappy shit. But
okay, stupid question. What about Toxic Holocaust?
I think Toxic Holocaust,
which I granted was in a different kind of, basically instantly became kind of pop, but or instantly moved into the sphere of more accessible stuff. But the music was formatted like this and based on all those bands. Yeah, and there were a number of other Toxic Holocaust wannabes that I can't remember.
No, definitely the exception that proves the rule, I would say, is Toxic Holocaust, because I thought about that while listening to this. And Toxic Holocaust, I like a lot.
I agree. I think they... Yeah.
It's music for, decibel tours, but he does it extremely well. Really nothing wrong with that. So here, Demonslaught's take is very much like a lot of late 80s stuff from South America. I think I say in the notes that if this was released in 87 in Chile, we would have 1,000 copies of this on vinyl released on Nuclear War right now. But what makes it especially interesting is a couple things. One, there's a sense that the musicians are kind of slumming it in a deliberate way, because there's a lot of just sort of deliberately reductive brick wall riffing on this, but there's also a lot of surprisingly sort of subtle, intricate guitar and drum work that'll pop up from time to time. So I think it's from guys who are actually really good musicians, but just drank like a six-pack apiece before they recorded. And the other interesting aspect, in keeping with the 1.5 wave, is this sort of light brushing of primitive death metal. Like I said, Nunslaughter is going to be a reference point. I think that the earliest stuff by Possessed is definitely a reference point, and probably the Death demos as well. So what you end up with is something that is basically cut to the pattern of what you're imagining, but just has this extra layer of sophistication on a lot of its different constituent parts that makes it a little bit more interesting. So with a big preamble out of the way, let me play a little bit so I can get your opinion. I want to go to Tormented by Evil. The first couple songs on this demo are okay, but it really picks up steam in the back half, which is where my samples are coming from. This is a really interesting track. Listen to all the different mid to late 80s reference points and technique, but then try to figure out if you've ever actually heard those things combined back in the late 80s. So, listening to that, I think the immediate comparison that's going to spring to mind is going to be sort of like early Venom, but it's not exactly correct. The sort of Celtic Frost idioms that they're using for a lot of the riffing on this record don't really sync up with the whole satanic speed metal thing. There's a lot of places on this demo where they're taking a certain set of intervals that are familiar to one period-appropriate style of late 80s extreme metal and kind of transplanting it into another structural context, which I find really interesting.
I guess I can hear the satanic speed metal thing as a production value, and the as in sort of in the inflection of the mutes, like it's a little bouncier or groovier than Celtic Frost would be, but like the first thing, the double pedal sort of palm mute thing that turns into these dissonant chords and then a weird bend up to a fifth or something, or a fourth, some like discordantly bright major key thing, that just seems like a Celtic Frost riff. I mean, you can tell it's an effort to write something like a Celtic Frost riff, like the Crypt of Ray's riff.
Yeah, I was actually going there myself mentally. It is, because Into the Crypt of Ray's is just filled with nothing but weird-ass riffs. It's like a classic extreme metal song that doesn't feature any of the sort of logic of later extreme metal riffs.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. And so this is a band doing that sort of deliberately rather than kind of by accident. But like it but there is a huge difference in the production values, right? It doesn't have the kind of dry lower mid bludgeoning tone. It has like Bathory production values, right?
Yeah.
One thing that interested me was the switch from the you have the double pedal part going, and then the change up, instead of switching to like a downbeat based riff or a mid-tempo riff or a blast or anything like that, right? They just go to another skank beat, which is hilarious.
Yeah.
Like it's basically, I don't know, in some sense it's basically the same beat, right? Boop dop, boop dop, boop dop, boop dop, boop dop. But like it feels like a really significant rhythmic shift, like maybe the guitar is shifting, the 16th feel drops out, and it just becomes much more like, or is the boop dop, is the skank beat actually hitting the downbeat in a way?
Yeah.
No, it's upbeat.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's like basically the same beat that that is carried over there, and it just gets more retarded in a way that I think is very like, that strikes me as kind of punk scene from that roughly that time period. That's like a bone-all strut.
Definitely, yeah. You can hear the very deliberate way this is linking back to 80s punk and Motorhead. Yeah. And I think that for this style of music, maintaining a really direct line back to that is really important.
Although nobody did those retarded skank beats in the 80s that I can find. The kick snare thing, that's like a deliberately, like, instead of doing the D beat or the faster Slayer beat, right? Doing this sort of like slow loping eighth note kick snare thing. That's like raw, this sort of like raw hardcore stuff from right around that time. I mean, you could like also say the Youth Attack bands or whatever, right? That's like one of the quote unquote stompy beats that you get a lot in black metal now. It's kind of as far as I can tell, it's a historical anomaly in this song that makes it less vintage than it might at first sound.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting record to listen to. When you're someone who's listened to a lot of that and like picking apart what could have been done and what couldn't have been done.
Yeah. The solo part is also really interesting because,
well, you could get there directly from Venom and Motorhead.
For sure, except that you're fucking up all the notes under it. Like they're playing like a I think under it is just like dum dum dum. You know, it's just like a Dorian idea. I don't think there's anything particularly dissonant there, but it just clashes at almost every note somehow with the solo, and it's they're playing in different scales, and it's pretty cool.
Yeah, it is pretty neat.
It's like the solo is where the song completely falls apart. It's basically like a noise solo.
Yeah. They're really maintaining the integrity of like never getting too good, never getting too coherent. So let's go to another sample, another really weird passage. This is going to be an additional situation where all these riffs are conceivably from the mid-'80s, but structured in a really weird modern way. And here you're going to hear some more of the kind of understated technicality. There's a really cool sort of intricate descending kind of legato line that's played on guitar here that's right out of the weirdest moments of the first Possessed record. Yeah, so that whole arrangement is pretty interesting, and I really like that what I would call a really pure example of a 1.5 wave riff, that main melodic riff in there, that da 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 da, yeah,
yep.
Because it's like a sort of a thrash melodic idiom, but played just as straight single note trem. Which is like a really sort of like an old funeral thing, a way to bridge the gap between those ideas that I really like. I don't know, there's something about this demo where it just strikes me as there's so many ideas and we can detect where they were all from, but they've never really been arranged like this, like that really weird just 2-chord like discharge interrupter riff that they use a few times there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've never heard that positioned next to songs with big like pentatonic Venom solos,
I think actually, yeah, that's the like nasty bend down from a major third to a minor third, right? That's that half step bend. I think that's what was happening under the solo in the previous song. I just my ear was a bit off, but yeah, that's why the solo sounded so fucked. Anyway, yes, that is very like extreme thrash to do, but also clearly hints at black metal melody. I mean, the trem line reminded me of Possessed.
Yeah. As soon as I heard it, I was like, oh, are we doing Burning in Hell?
Hail! This is Brandon from Cromlech, and you're listening to Terminus.
And we are back from a quick break discussing the virtues of Bastard Priest and Legion of the Damned to review something very different. Condamnés by Karne on Epictural Productions. So this is the third record of this French band. It follows Symposium of Torments back in 2017, which was one of those records that I sort of clocked as very cool, but didn't really listen to much, and kept an eye on the band, though. So I was stoked when this came out. Basically, that record, from what I remember, it was, conspicuously French, but it was it seemed like basically kind of a fuck-off nowadays black metal thing, where it was very aggressive, storming, kind of geometric, a little bit more like, a little bit more like the Norse bands or Marduk than this record. And this record is really a huge branching out in terms of sound. This one, I really like this. This is the first record I've heard this year, and that made me go like, oh, now that's a black metal record. It probably helps that there is very full band playing, and that they capture the full spectrum of black metal emotions without leaning on, second wave revivalism. Mm-hmm. Instead, this seems like a statement on the essence of French black metal, which is basically it's built like a Gothic cathedral, and it sounds like the apocalypse, and it has to be aggressive, right? Now, obviously, a lot of the, some of the best known French bands you wouldn't exactly say are remarkable for their aggression, right? Mutilation or something, right? And there's clearly a link to all of those bands here. But what these guys insist on is play black metal and black metal, right? As something that could measure up to the aggression and intensity of the 90s Norse and Swedish bands. And this was like, and at the time, it's pretty brutal places, but at the same time, it's extremely listenable in a way that's kind of refreshing. The first time I put this on, I listened to it 2.5 times. Mm-hmm. I was like, so it feels like a very complete record, as you say in your notes, sort of reminds of a time from before the underground splintered into a bunch of micro niches. But if there's like a originary moment this band is harkening back to, it's going to be early 2000s France, which is basically when French black metal emerged, or mid 2000s France, when French black metal kind of emerged as the new contender, right? Before then, you had the LLN, you had you had Senior Voland and Crystal Nacht and all that, and Osculum Infam. But this was the point at which there were more high concept, high musicianship French bands. And number one, the first thing I thought when I heard this is like DSO without all the clutter.
Well, it's kind of like it's DSO, but hearing DSO purely as a French black metal band rather than as an Orthodox band.
Yeah, I like that distinction. That this doesn't really sound like Orthodox black metal at all. It's not dependent on the skronk chord, and it is much more focused on direct melodic attack rather than either atmosphere or kind of like theatrics. So it sounds like a bit like Infernal Battles and Inquisitors of Satan. I think it has a lot of that, but without the kind of most derivative aspects of those records. So this doesn't just sound like totally undigested Gorgoroth riffs, right? And what it really sounds like maybe is just the most powerful moments on C Monumentum, but absent both the moments of kind of labored, churning chord work that, goes in between them, and more so absent the sort of the things that are supposed to be essential but that are actually filler, like the choir, the 5-minute long tracks of choral stuff.
Yeah.
Without these grand gestures that tell us to hear it as art, right? If you just like the Carnal Malefactor riff, this is the record for you.
Yeah.
And you could say the same thing about the other main influence here, which I think is Peste Noire. I'm not sure I would have said that until recently, but I went back and listened to Sonne de Siècle for this show, basically, and was pretty blown away. And it's like the most elaborate, glorious riffing on that, minus the kinds of deliberately wacky things that Peste Noire was doing at that time, right? Which again were kind of this. I think it was a little more effective in Peste Noire on those early records, at least before it got too out of hand. But again,
at the beginning, it was breaking out of a form, but then it coalesced into a form of its own.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. It was this sort of explosive new possibility space, and it was tempered by immediate songcraft, right? But it was definitely, the bizarre explosions of folk stuff, or as we say on the show, gay circus music. Sort of, they were tempered by just immediate riff and songcraft. But those are the moments everyone latched onto because they were the extras that somehow signaled that this was art or whatever, right? And then eventually sort of Peste Noire got taken over by the concept and by the extras. Mm-hmm. This is very this record is kind of a statement, but it's a statement by being very non-conceptual. They strip away all the superficial markers of like, this is art, and they just make art.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's a record with a high level of technical skill and structural complexity, but it's still remarkably straightforward in its delivery. It is while it is more elaborate than most, it is still basically a riff-to-riff black metal record. Mm-hmm. It's because I really like this one a lot. I think this is going to be like a weird dark horse that ends up on my year-end list. But it's also something that requires several listens to fully digest. Because the way these songs are arranged tends to be super linear and like a compounding sort of linearity, because so much of it is based around like single winding lead guitar riffs that will extend past the boundaries of rhythm riffs and sort of, that Into Oblivion style of just like single neoclassical melodies. And
yeah, I like that. That's a good comparison.
Yeah, and the melodic ideas on display are definitely from like firmly within French black metal tradition, but just executed at a really, really high skill level with certain inflections. I think that this is more authentically like early and mid-2000s French black metal than most of the French-style black metal we hear, because we all know what kind of those French melodic intervals sound like now, but we forget just how kind of wild they were on a lot of the older records in the style. Some of the rough edges have been sanded off, and they're not sanded off here. There's a lot of very strange intervallic choices where you kind of have to like sit with a melody for a few seconds to see where it's going to justify some of these huge leaps across the fretboard.
Yeah, huge leaps across the fretboard is a great way of describing it. I mean, there's one specific technique, which is just like swoop up an octave or more, that DSO uses at some key dramatic moments, that is just like completely integrated into Karn's technique.
Yeah, I was actually thinking of that specifically. Yeah, they use that a lot, where they're bouncing between octaves, or even I think between like they're skipping a whole octave in between the two that they're hitting. There's a lot of just like really wild string skipping stuff, but it never seems like overly flashy or technical. It's just the kind of thing you get by sitting down with a guitar for a really long time and puzzling out very deliberately what you want to do. So this is very high art in the sense that it's got this kind of neoclassical construction, but it's also really good at just providing the straightforward heavy metal kicks that were always a part of French black metal. I'm always going to go back to Hero Lorn, which also has the connection to DSO there. Hero Lorn is something I tie to this, but actually the thing that this really reminds me of, which might seem weird at first, is a band that you and I have talked about, but I don't think we brought up on the show, which is NYSS, NYSS, who are a newer band. Like in the last 10 years or so, they've only done a couple records, but I really, really like them. And anyone who has heard NYSS might think this is a weird comparison, because NYSS is very spare and very austere and deliberately minimal, and this is certainly none of those things. But the thing about NYSS is, for all of its sort of high-minded, almost hipsterish aesthetics, it's really just based around really, really, really good French black metal riffs. And ones that are very carefully chosen and just barely adorned in the way that a lot of the riffs on this record are. So I think there's a sort of spiritual similarity between those two. But yeah, no, overall, I think this is a really good record, because it's got the sufficient complexity to be interesting for a bunch of listens and to be high art, but it also has all the direct, enjoyable quality of traditional French black metal. So yeah, it is kind of a referendum on the state of the regional style, and I think that it pulls it off better than a whole hell of a lot of bands are right now.
Yeah, I agree. This is definitely year end for me. I mean, the NYSS comparison is interesting because, as you said in your notes, it may raise an eyebrow for some. And when I read it, I thought, I'm raising my eyebrow. But the way you explain it makes sense. It's like NYSS does this extreme, even though the music isn't even really structured like black metal, right? I remember you talking about it being structured like industrial, right?
Yeah, it's structured kind of like electronic music or something.
Yeah. Even though there's a ton about it that is very different, on a melodic level, it really is an effort to distill the French style to its essentials. And it's like Karne is operating at an equal level of concentration and potency, but the scale has been like quadrupled. It's like every melody is 4 times as long, if not more. The songs are the songs have way more parts in them. There's like multiple layers of harmonization. Last thing I want to flag, which I'll mention again, is the importance of tandem guitar style here.
Mm-hmm. It's the foundation of this whole record.
Yes. And it may actually be something that sets it apart from its influences. That is, DSO, dominated by one guitarist, right? Peste Noire, dominated by one guitarist. These guys play tandem riffs written in tandem in the way that the Swedes did in the 90s. And they can do that because they've had a remarkably stable lineup. These two guys... the main two dudes listed as Rido, like the Rune, and HKA have played together since 2012. And the vocalist has also been a pretty consistent off and on member. So,
yeah, there's definitely full band energy here. And what's interesting is you talking about how it's like, oh, it's the things that you like about French black metal just sort of like upscaled, which is completely true, and it's also one of the reasons why this is going to be just like a totally underground gem and will never be Instagram popular. Because it's like, it's actually demanding on the listener. Like, the amount that you get out of this album is going to be very closely related to how much attention you're paying. I think this is a record that really rewards genuinely focused listening in a way that a lot of popular French black metal at this point has been distilled down to, this sort of catchy pop black stuff, when historically French black metal was always like pretty intricate and pretty complex. So it's interesting to say how much of that, I guess there's an argument to be made by some that maybe some of it was just sort of like maximalist cruft that wasn't doing anything, which is probably true. And
we've both made that argument, but it's mostly about the the extras rather than the writing itself.
Yeah. It's like, I mean, DSO, I've had a contentious relationship with that band my whole life, but they can pull off huge, amazing riffs periodically. It's just, I've never been into, as you said, all the sort of conceptual extras that came along with it. So it's cool to hear a record that's basically doing all the cool parts of DSO in this very streamlined, very direct fashion. So speaking of which, should I just go for the first sample?
Yeah, let's let him have it.
Yeah, and this is good because this is very directly related to DSO. So I'm going to go to the song Limbus Puerorum.
Yeah. Limbo of the Children.
Oh, okay. So it's interesting because there is this sort of oblique orthodox feel to some of the riff craft on this record, but maybe that's just by way of DSO. Maybe it's not really orthodox, it's just DSO, but I don't know. I would have to listen to more orthodox again to really think about it. But here you're going to hear basically riffs that are structured in the manner of orthodox black metal riffs, but with just much more interesting melodic content that comes from the French black metal tradition. And in addition, another thing that separates it from DSO or from a lot of the French Orthodox bands is that it feels highly organic. Every part feels necessary and related to every other part. And is it a smoother listening experience? Sure, but I don't think it loses any of its high contrast and high energy as a result. Yeah, so right off the bat, that opens with sort of Karn's version of a spooky DSO arpeggio. But instead of just sort of laying on that chord shape, I know how to play it on guitar, but I don't know what you call it. It's like 5-7-7-6 going down the strings. It's ooh, the spooky interval. So instead of doing that, they just kind of make it like as you were saying while I was playing, like a doom riff. And then everything sort of spills out from there. But the lead guitar, or I guess they're both kind of lead guitars, the higher pitched guitar is the guiding voice for this entire section. And I like the way it keeps the lead keeps going, it never really repeats itself, and it changes mood along with a whole set of different riffs being played under it. I also really like that when they go into the sort of aggressive, interrupting Dark Throne riff, they don't, it's been a while since we said that. We haven't heard an interrupting Dark Throne riff in a while. Here, it's actually really cool because they take that riff and they write it with the same seriousness that they do the more melodic material. It's not a stock in the shadow of the horns type phrase. It's thought through. You know, it's there's just little twists on it. It's 3 bars long, which gives it kind of a lopsided feel and allows them to do something with the last measure. There's a lot of play just within that section. And then they very smoothly bring it back into a blast beat with that arpeggiated intro and then another lead on top of it. There's just a really sophisticated kind of agglutinative songwriting going on.
And at the end, the lead is going insane. He's like, it sounds like he's maybe just soloing. Yeah. Like improvising.
This band also, another weird comparison, this band kind of reminds me of Plaga in a lot of places. You know, and I talk about Plaga on the show a lot, but Plaga does a lot of similar stuff where they'll take a, you know, you'll have sort of a simple rhythm riff and then a lead that is played in almost a bluesy idiom, not in the sense of like the interval choices, but in the way that it selects 5 or 6 notes and just sort of explores the relationship between all of them. Just kind of hangs out in this little box on the fretboard.
I think I know what you mean. Yeah. Again, well, that's another good sign about this band, that it bears comparison to something as stripped down as Nice, or in a different way, Plaga, is a sign of the fact that there's no fat here.
I think these guys.
But let's talk about the aggressive. Let's talk about the aggressive riff more. Speaking of which, like there's like 2. I think you're totally right that they write that. It's just, it's like the best version of that riff I've heard in I don't know how long, right? In part, it actually has a melodic shape to it. The turnaround at the end is brutal and unexpected. And then they do another riff that does the same thing but different, where a weaker band would go back to the blast immediately. It's fully committed. They're like, no, we're going to crank up the aggression with this second one, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that is an important thing to note, is that there is a real premium placed on maintaining that level of aggression, you know, despite how sort of delicate a lot of these melodies are. You know, there's lots of like gossamer, almost whispery lead lines on this, but it always feels like it's the star on top of the Christmas tree. It draws the eye, but it's not the entirety of the foliage, you know?
I like that.
And I think that one thing that you also mentioned when you were kind of giving the intro of the album, I think it is important to note that it's like, this is the first black metal album I've heard in a long while, even on the show, that is like, yes, this is a very good black metal album.
Yes, it's such a relief.
Well, it's like 2022 was just all the best black metal albums were also death metal albums. You know?
Well, and within black metal itself, the best things were focused niche exercises. So the most comparable things, both of which I liked a lot, were the record by Gregorian, but that was like deliberately one-dimensional, right? It was sort of similar tonally in certain ways to this, but much more on the, you know, Marduk side of it, much more dissonant and deliberately just pummeling. And on the other side, maybe the Ataigar record, which has a similar scope, but again, that also has its own very specific niche, because all of that, as you observed, and I think more and more is true, that record really was sort of deliberately distant and atmospheric, even though it had a bunch of kind of spiky riffs in it.
Yeah. That is, you know, the Ataigar was something that was very indebted to a sort of late 90s, early 2000s model of like what we originally called atmospheric black metal. You know, Lunar Aurora, not shit about trees, you know.
Hey, Lunar Aurora was about trees. They were just tougher trees.
Yeah. It was very hardwood. I one of the things that I like best about this album is just that it is exactly what it says on the tin. It's only a black metal record, you know. It's weird for me to say it because it's like last year I almost felt bad. It's like all the black metal albums that I liked were just ones that were like doing a lot of death metal things.
Yeah.
So it's nice to be like, okay, finally a pure black metal record. There was also the Shavat from earlier this year, which I still really love, but that's also like, you know, it's got its post-black inflections and shit. This is the most severe and straightforward one we've had in a while.
Yeah, the Shavat record is great, but to me, just because it has its post-black thing, and because it's still clearly a one-man effort, right? It doesn't quite tick this box in the same way.
Yeah, it's definitely it's on its own thing, and that's also not trying to be aggressive for the most part.
It's like narrative songwriting, as you said. Yeah.
So let me go to another one where we get to hear more cool leads. Just kidding, that's every song on this album is built around really cool leads. So I don't know if I have a ton to say about this sample, but I really love how melodramatic this lead line is. You're going to hear some of that really cool sort of demented, like, super long slide or string skipping stuff that we were talking about earlier. And really, what makes this record so good is just a matter of degree. It's a matter of the skill on display. Most of these songs are based around a lead line interacting with really sort of wide, spread out 4-string tremmed chords. But these guys are just so good at intuiting the natural progression of these songs while still dotting them with enough twists and turns to not just be an exercise in like a particular style. So let's go to Kapha, and then we'll listen to it, and then I'll immediately compare it to the other band that we all love. Yeah, so there we've got basically everything that this band does really well in less than 2 minutes. You've got that really crazy, winding, spindly lead line with those really dramatic leaps across the fretboard. You've got just really distinct, articulate, melodic ideas, and I'll get back to that in a moment. The sort of like crusher interrupter riff, again, is very good. That's one of the best articulations of one of those just sort of... That's almost like a Horna riff. That's like a French take on a Horna riff.
That's a lot like a Horna riff, yeah.
Some of those melodic turns are very Horna, because I've been listening to them a lot more lately.
Cool. I approve.
Yeah, and no, it's really awesome. And the big point of comparison that we're going to make is I'm going to compare it to Spite Extreme Wing, the band that every good band sounds like, but none of them have ever listened to. And you followed up on that in the notes, and you're completely right. It is about these sort of like powerfully shaped, very incisive riffs that are sort of geometric without ever being skronky. You always describe Spite Extreme Wing riffs as being like lightning bolts, straight lines and sharp angles, but very clear. And that applies to a lot of the riffing on this record, too.
There's lightning bolt, but the strange thing about Spite Extreme Wing and about this, yes, the lightning bolt thing for sure. So the weird thing, right, there are also parts of Spite Extreme Wing that are just like graceful, curvilinear kind of things, right? Like on, I don't know, Claremont, I always come back to, or I don't know. There's a bunch of songs that just kind of, Spite Extreme Wing also soars a lot, right? And on Ultra, they make that into the whole sound, right? But like the there's, the interesting thing is on this record too, there are lightning bolts, but also even in these big curving, swooping tremolines or whatever, there are these inflection points. That's like the lightning bolt thing, but it's like the way to visualize it almost, I think, is like for Spite Extreme Wing is more geometric. Karne is like Gothic architecture, right?
That's good. Yeah, because it's Gothic, whereas Spite Extreme Wing are very deliberately doing this sort of like evil light modernist thing.
Yeah, classical sort of both. Yeah, classical austerity but like reimagined in this sort of geometric modernist way. And so in this case, think about the Gothic cathedral. I mean, you instantly got it, but for the listeners, right, you want like, think about like flying buttresses and vaults, and in the French Gothic cathedrals, right, you have these just really intense curves coming to points in the Gothic arch, and coming to points and being sort of colliding and bouncing off each other and interacting, and this just like stunning level of detail everywhere, like you get in some of those lead lines you were talking about. The key is, how do you write a really powerful riff? It has to have inflection points, and even cooler if there are these inflection points that will turn it from like spiky lightning bolt into smooth flowing archway, right?
Yeah, it's and that really has to do, I think, with just like, how do you do that practically? I don't even think it's necessarily the writing. I think it's just the full band energy and just how good and musical these guys are. Which is, it's sort of an absurd thing to describe a band as musical, It's like, I would hope so. We're making music, but you know what I mean. There's certain kinds of guys, like, for instance, I'm a guy who got into playing guitar to like play black and death metal. So everything I do on guitar is just geared toward that. These guys feel a lot more well-rounded on their instruments.
I think it has something to do with the writing, but maybe not something you could, maybe not a rule you could prescribe, right?
Yeah, it's not something you could offshore in the way that you can just the DSO riff,
Nothing here is sort of, nothing here is on autopilot, but, another thing, a thing that's kind of between writing per se and just musicianship would be like rhythm in the wrist, right? So like the way Argento will like mark each trem run and like turn and pivot and dive from one trem run to another. These guys do that. When you hear those swoops, right? There's like changes in articulation that are very musician-y, but like they're written into the riff.
Yeah, that is true. Here it feels more organic than Spite. And I really like that. I really like this record in general. I think this is something that's going to stick with me, and I'm just going to listen to it more and more, and I'm probably going to start really picking it apart for guitar ideas and shit.
Yeah, for sure. So next one, this is, I don't know, how do I introduce it? Honestly, if I want to like show off some, I might reverse my samples. If you want like another example of that kind of inflected, spiky, pivoting riff, the sort of highly contoured writing, let's go to a cool example of the hybrid riff.
Sure.
So this was like, it's easy to hear in this case because there's a tonal shift in the middle of the riff. So this is from the last track on the record. I didn't want to give away the surprise, but then I did. It's just really good. Maybe I'll save the gushing about it till later, but from a songwriting perspective, right, you're going to start off in a really cool, another, as you pointed out, really cool version of a standard orthodox arpeggio passage with some tap picking that's kind of like Peste Noire. It's going to transform, and then you'll hear a one-off, just a barnstorming one-off riff that has like 2 to 3 different parts in it. It's never repeated. It just fires off the next part of the song. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, those are all great.
Yeah, so we've got, there's, in any sample, there's a ton you can talk about here. But at the end of the sample, you could hear under the big block chords, the trill actually returns. Mm-hmm. The tap picking. But basically, yes, you could hear how they turn the tap picking into this just insistent, as you would say, shepherd's tone kind of thing, right? Mm-hmm. And then just boom, a riff that is just like an effort to outdo DSO, right?
Yeah, that is just totally like the big Sola Fide riff,
Yeah, but like more.
Yeah.
Right? I kind of get the sense that this is one of those things where it's like, we love DSO so much we have to kill them. Right? Which Christian I'm sure would really approve of, right? He'd be like, yes.
Finally, you've cracked the code.
Yeah, exactly. So that riff just rockets in every direction at once. There's a good example of, although it's always, as you say, with this organic flowing execution, that riff kind of lightning bolts all over the place.
Yeah.
In an instant, right? Just, and then it evens out sweeps up, turns around, like gets a little bit of a darker phrasing, and then eventually drops into a gnarly tritone and just sits there. which spins us into the next riff. But there's a very good, that riff has like, I mean, it either has 3 inflection points or it has 16.
Yeah.
And that launches this next riff, which is just astonishingly good on a record that, like, where you've heard just extremely well executed versions of classic French black metal riffs. You could even say that about that insane one-off riff that I just talked about for like 3 minutes, right? It's a really well executed classic French black metal riff. This next one just seems like a Karne riff. Like, I've never heard a band play something like that. At first it has that kind of intense death metal skronk, right? You can maybe hear some of DSO's influences there. You could hear some Soren or some Sentenced. Mm-hmm. But by the end of the phrase, right, there's this like lifting key change that gives it that sighing turn, right? Maybe a bit of the fainting vampire.
Yeah, no, there's a set of very specific intervals that French black metal bands use that are just so... They just put France into your head. There's this one phrase, this like 4-note cluster. I always call it like the Requiem for a Dream cluster, because like on the main song from the soundtrack for that movie, there is this very francophone note cluster that occurs on it, and you'll hear it in a lot of French black metal riffs, and I heard it on this one too.
That makes sense. So yeah, this riff, just as it starts out, it's a really gnarly riff. It depends totally on the tandem harmony, right? They're just playing, it's disharmonic all the way through, 2 lines. And each time it repeats, it's different, and each time it repeats, it sounds more and more French.
Yeah.
And there's another riff like that I got a flag on the beginning of Limbus Puerorum, which you skipped entirely, which is fine, because there's an embarrassment of riches, right?
Yeah.
There's just a crazy good riff passage, which again has some of this more eerie, the sort of eerie disharmonic melodies, kind of whiplashing around in cool ways. Those two really feel like specific riffs only this band could write. And expanding forward, I would love to hear more of that stuff without abandoning any of the other things that make this so awesome.
Yeah, you know? No, I think that if Karne are very good at sort of, I mean, if we want to boil every regional style of black metal down to like a single adjective, I guess the one that you use for French black metal is sort of wistful in a way, but they, the problem is a lot of modern bands emulating the French style just boil it down to just that, whereas Karne sees it as a launching pad for a whole lot more sort of emotional and melodic shades they can put onto that.
Well, I feel like here, the sort of the yearning or the melancholy or despair, you can have that where it is just sort of fainting vampire, right? As is everything, all this sort of effete kind of goofy shit these days. However, that's, as you say, that's just lifting one part of it. Mm-hmm. This band reinstalls that in its original context, which is it's like apocalyptic melancholy, right? It's very sad that the world is ending, but, you did it.
Yeah, I mean, we're here. I mean, what are we going to do?
Yeah. Very, very, it's unfortunate that the world is ending, but it's also very cool.
Yeah.
And so this is, it returns the grandeur to it.
I can agree with that. Yeah, I mean, if there's 2 inflections on French black metal, and one is sort of like epic adventuring music, and the other is this sort of, sneering, dispossessed depression thing. These guys are really good at unifying those ideas.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so now let's get to the last sample. I mean, this is, here's a perfect title. Le silence est d'ordre. no. Is there anything more to say?
Not really. It's just really fucking good. Well, after a break, after talking about a lovely, elaborate French black metal record, it's time to go for something absolutely within the same niche that will please all of the same audience. This is the newest record by Hymen Holocaust, titled The Death King, out on Rotten Roll Rex, which is a really great label. We just very rarely have the opportunity to cover something that like makes sense from it, but if you guys are into this kind of thing, Rotten Roll Rex is a phenomenal label. So Hymen Holocaust is a Dutch one-man pornogrind band. I'm using the term pornogrind loosely, but we'll go with it for now. I've been listening to him basically since the first couple records came out in 2006, and now this is the 6th full-length that the project has produced. It seems like he knocks out a couple real quick, kind of goes into hibernation, does it again, and repeats that cycle. It's sort of like a project he does when he's not doing other things. Because the guy behind this has a history in Clit Eater, which is a pretty well-known Dutch death grind band who are pretty cool. So pornogrind as an idea is interesting. Hymen Holocaust exists in this sort of intersecting nexus of like gore and pornogrind and old school death metal and like primitive extreme metal, but just the idea of pornogrind is interesting because when people use that term they mean a few different things. We can be talking about themes, we can be talking about a certain kind of scene, but I would make an argument that there is a pretty distinct musical identity to what I would call pornogrind. And the roots of it aren't necessarily what everyone expects. I mean, you would look at some of this stuff, listen to a little bit of it, and you would assume that it's gore grind bands who swapped dead girls for alive and naked girls. But it's not really exactly like that. Where pornogrind really springs out of like a noise grind tradition. Connecting all the way back to Anal Cunt, but especially through stuff like the Meat Shits, their early noise grind material. Later on, Gut, the sort of like establishing preeminent pornogrind band, who had a lot of those sort of anal cunt-isms, but started to move it in a different direction, and then really getting consolidated by bands like Cock and Ball Torture and Rompa-Prop, those sorts of dudes. So the history of pornogrind is deeply intertwined with a tradition of sort of like extreme experimental music, which is also why a lot of the pornogrind bands...
That is interesting. I didn't realize that.
I never really thought about it in so many words until I started thinking about doing this review. But yeah, and I think that a lot of people, for obvious reasons, it's something that's very easy to dismiss out of hand. But if you listen to a band like Cock and Ball Torture, the kind of stuff they're doing has never really been replicated. They have an entirely unique set of riffing idioms that you don't really hear outside of that tiny little niche scene. Because I think a lot of what makes pornogrind cool is that a lot of its conceits originally started as sort of just musical jokes, but then they were elaborated and iterated upon. So the sort of like bizarre, bluesy rock and roll groove you'll hear on early Gut is kind of a joke at first. I mean, obviously they also think it's just cool to do, but then that becomes part of a musical vocabulary. So I guess I say this as sort of a preface when talking about Hymen Holocaust to say that when you listen to this project, this is way down that rabbit hole of pornogrind, which is why so much of this just coming from a more standard death or black metal background will sound so alien. Because if you really listen to it, these aren't, death metal riffs. They're not really grind riffs. They're their own kind of thing. And what those riffs connect to most distinctly is, I think, a really important conversation, but I'll have that a little bit later once we've done some listening. Black metal guy, I assume this is probably the first full pornogrind record you've ever listened to. So what do you think about this as an intro to the style?
This one is not... I gotta say, I'm not that excited by this one.
Okay, that's fair.
Trying to figure out what... I've heard other pornogrind stuff that sounded crazier to me. And maybe Gut or something. both like sort of like more sort of blown out, demented tonalities, and yeah, maybe a little more abrasive, maybe vocals more forward in the mix. Mm-hmm. This has kind of a warmer guitar tone, and the vocals sort of blend into the guitar in the way that you kind of might do with those more atmospheric, brutal death vocals. Mm-hmm. But the riffing is very different. That said, these impressions of pornogrind are pretty old, right? So maybe if you had played me Hymen Holocaust, 5 or 10 years ago when I was, or longer ago, right? When I was checking this stuff out first, I would have been like, oh, that's fucking insane. Right? But this is... So other thoughts, yeah. I guess... in some way, yeah, I guess the thing is, to me, this is a rather straightforward riff-based record where their focus really isn't the riffs. It's just written riff by riff. And it's kind of basically structured like, it's a lot more of a hardcore record.
Yeah, I was thinking that myself. This is sort of structured more like stripped-down hardcore in a lot of ways.
Yeah, you get some just straight-up death metal riffs, and obviously the tone choice is different. Maybe part of it is just hearing one-man hardcore. Just doesn't quite hit right for me. It's like you need a band for that. But, like, other general thing, when you were talking about, like, pornogrind having its own sort of vocabulary, maybe of these kind of, like, chopped up hardcore riffs, it's also got like its own tempo, right? To me, the characteristic thing has always been extremely slowed down, exaggerated skank beats, and that it's actually not centered on blasts at all.
Yeah, it's the tupa tupa.
Right, and so it's the thing that makes it, even though it comes out of, anal cunt and whatever, it's not really yeah, that's something that throws people for a loop, probably. They might expect it to be speedy grindcore, but it's really... If this is grind, it's in the more free sense of the term.
Oh yeah. I would say that the grind thing is sort of like a leftover conceit. In that it emerges from there. And for instance, like Hymen Holocaust is a Dutch project, and a ton of pornogrind comes out of the Netherlands.
I'm shocked.
Well, because this actually isn't the case for the guy behind Hymen Holocaust, but so many of those guys have some sort of affiliation with Last Days of Humanity. LDOH is just this breeding ground for all their friends bands and all the side projects of the guys in LDOH. It's actually this absurdly fertile creative environment. I mean, that's where we get like the concepts of modern gore noise and shit like that. It's a launch pad for a ton of niche styles that emphasize different aspects.
All right. Well, that is... Yeah, but also it's the Netherlands.
Yeah, of course. They're the porniest. Well, no, the Germans, I think, are the porniest, but...
The Germans have the sort of... it's different kinds, right? In the Netherlands, they sort of let it all hang out. For the Germans, it more... it's the, deeply pent-up sort of energy, exploding and unpredictable and, bizarrely perverse ways.
That's why cock and ball torture's from Germany.
Yeah. Although these days, I guess that explosion's been happening for at least 30 years in Germany. So.
Yeah. Well, I think you do point out something pretty relevant, which is I figured a sticking point for you on this record would be the fact that it's at that sort of cruising speed that you're usually not that into.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's true. But how is it different from Coffins, right? Because Coffins maybe it's a little faster than Coffins.
It is slightly faster than Coffins, and I think Coffins, like, it's interesting because I think they're accessing a ton of the same ingredients, both Coffins and this band.
Yeah.
But I think that Coffins, one, it's a full band. It's not, a one-man project. It's not as sort of deliberately mechanical as Hymen Holocaust is. And also just, like, the things they do, the kind of grooves that Coffins is into just tend to be more propulsive owing to that little bit of crust. Like, Coffins is always a really slowed down D beat, and then Hymen Holocaust is the tupa tupa.
It has the more it has the intense syncopation of the D beat, and the guitarist is accenting. The guitarist is doing D beat picking in a way that gives it a little more propulsion. I think that's right. So here, there's a kind of but okay, I think that helps distinguish it. It's not so much the tempo as the rhythmic feel at this tempo. But you should probably give him an example.
Sure. I can do my first one or your first one.
Let's do a you one first, since you'll have better things to say about it.
Yeah, sure. So basically, I'll give up the secret up front. I think that the primary actual riffing influence on this record, and Hymen Holocaust, and a lot of pornogrind in general, isn't contemporary death or grind bands. It's actually Celtic Frost. And I think that they get there by way of Mortician, where I've said on the show a few times, Mortician riffs are actually more like Celtic Frost riffs than death metal riffs. Like, Mortician isn't really a death metal band. It's weird to say it that way, but like the guitar work has nothing to do with death metal. Here that comes out really clearly, because clearly this is a band that owes a lot to Mortician, but takes Mortician ideas and takes them even further down the rabbit hole into this very strange direction, owing to the fact that this is the 6th full-length record by this guy. So what happens when you're taking a deliberately restrictive, sort of bare-bone style like Celtic Frost riffing and you're on your 6th album? Well, shit tends to get pretty weird, and you start playing with rhythm and timbre in ways that you might not expect. So we'll go to a song called Nutting to Nothing, and it's fascinating to try to get in the head of like how this was written, because clearly this is a song that was written based around a single rhythmic idea. So let's listen to it, and then you guys listening at home, see if you can find out what that rhythmic idea is, and then once you've locked onto it, see how he plays with it and contorts it across the surface of the music. So something really interesting happens on this song. So everything on this song is based around that little 4-note snare drag. So what happens is the drums are designed so we've got a couple back and forth A-B riffs up front that are just kind of straightforward pornogrind riffs. Then this long, slow trem riff begins, and then the drumming underneath it is arranged in such a way that it feels like it's sort of splitting the bars. The little
it feels like it's 6/4.
Yeah. It's like 6/4 against a 4/4 riff, and then it's coming together after a few repetitions. It's like a very simplified Meshuggah polyrhythm kind of thing, and that's really interesting. Then the following riff, that stompy tupa tupa thing, the 4-note snare drum roll becomes an inflection, but played on the riff. With that little 4-note palm mute sequence that keeps recurring throughout it. So he's taking this... Yeah. Okay. So he's basically taking this very simple rhythmic fragment, and then he's just moving it around, which is a really... it's a very simple thing, but it's a weird thing that you don't typically hear in metal, an arrangement like that. That's almost more of like a jazz thing. And then that very strange sound object type solo comes in, that with that weird swimming watery quality to it. And that's not something you typically hear in pornogrind. You're not hearing people do lead guitar basically ever. So that also connects it to, like I said, this sort of experimental and noise grind tradition, which is, you'll hear a lot of those kinds of sound objects throughout this record. Sometimes it's like lead guitar, sometimes it's just like some weird sample in the background or something, but there's always some extra feature on these tracks that sort of isolates it as the song where this weird thing happens.
Yeah, this one is very odd, and I like this one. Right, this is the change from the kind of oddly staggered time to the skank part is also very that's really effective, because you go from this sort of everything spilling over the edge of its measure to being like rigidly segmented.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah,
it's almost like they're playing the skank beat. It's not like they're one of the weird things about pornogrind, right? Is that the skank beat is maybe being unsyncopated, or it's landing. The kick lands directly on the one. Doop tap, doop tap, doop tap, doop tap. More like a polka beat.
Because it is a polka beat. Yeah.
Yeah. Dun 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 doop tap, doop tap, doop tap, doop tap, do 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 do, and that's what gives it that kind of knuckle dragging retard feel.
Exactly. Now you're thinking with portals, black metal guy. Where pornogrind is about finding very subtle and elaborate ways to do knuckle dragging retard music.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think this is just a good example of what makes this album pretty cool to me, is that, this is a record that still has those grind priors, so the songs are pretty short and pretty simple. It's usually just 3, maybe 4 riffs per song. But there's a lot of careful decisions being made to make the relationships between those riffs and the relationships between different rhythmic idioms kind of distinct. It's an album with 13 tracks on it, and just a new, simple but novel idea is explored on each of them, and I think that goes a long way to enhancing the replay value of something like this.
Yeah, well, okay, here's another one with a simple, novel idea. This one is always hardcore, and that's basically the track right before the one you just sampled. But let's go. that actually really reminds me of both of your samples on the Demonslaught.
Oh, yeah, it kind of does.
So,
I get that.
Before we get to that, though, the thing that's not on the Demonslaught record, right, is the most obvious just sort of marker for this song is that kind of circle pit warm-up riff, right? The tom roll. Right?
And actually, while listening to that, I think what that drum beat actually is a slowed down intro to Hot for Teacher.
Well, it's definitely that too. Yeah, that's a good point. But that has a more 4/4 feel, not a polyrhythmic kind of thing.
Yeah, he's
this is more
because I believe that Morris, he was the drummer for Clit Eaters, so I believe that these are real drums.
I think the beginning of Hot for Teacher is more like the Motorhead Overkill beat tripping over itself because it's so horny. But like it's I would believe this guy likes that song. I don't know, it has that sort of like tribal toms in a 90s or 2000s hardcore song, you know, like it is.
Oh no, I totally know what you're getting at. Yeah, it's like it is those big tom intros to cool hardcore songs.
And then, you know, it just gets interrupted. On this record, everything is the interrupting riff. Every riff works by interrupting the one that came before, right? You get that pit wind-up riff. It should lead organically to some kind of, I don't know, maybe a skank, a two-step, or a breakdown, or maybe even a different kind of skank part. But then we just get this, like, buzzsaw death metal riff, right? Which is really, really elemental death metal in kind of the same way as that proto black metal riff on the second Demonslaught sample, right?
Yeah,
that's a really thin trem riff.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of these sort of slow winding trem riffs. I'm guessing are sort of like a play on old Incantation.
That makes sense. But then there's that like weird ass solo where, as with the Demonslaught, that first sample, the song just fucking falls apart on purpose.
Yeah.
And it's awesome, right? You also get the conflicting layers, right? There's a lead that's sort of doing something, but the star of the show is this bizarre kind of crumbling, super heavy down-tuned rhythm riff, which is very dissonant, deliberately clashing with the solo. And then the gnarliest part of that whole sequence is you think the riff is going to loop, but it actually does a key change, and I think he plays the same riff even lower.
Yeah, there's a weird thing that he's playing at like a third lower. It's not like a standard like fifth shift, like just going down a string. There's something odder happening there.
Yeah, and it's it sounds very drunk. And the lead suggests, both parts really suggest Celtic Frost and Hellhammer, but like different parts of different riffs. It's, you know, you can really hear it there.
Yeah, I think that I think this is a guy who clearly has like a wide variety of things that he's interested in, and it's always interesting to hear. You know, Celtic Frost and Celtic Frost riffs are such a Rorschach test. In that, you know, basically every extreme metal band has taken something from Celtic Frost and they've all interpreted it very differently. This whole record is sort of like, well, it's funny because we were talking about Demonslaught. I knew a lot of this was going to come back. It's as though Procreation of the Wicked was like the template for this entire band, and he just took it into this like insanely fucked up weird direction for something that was already insanely weird and fucked up when it came out, and still kind of is. Like, the main riff on Procreation of the Wicked does not make any sort of sense. So anyway, I'll go to another one called Black Hole Sun. That is SON. They're all pun titles, and they're all fun. And here I want to talk about the timbres of this music, because honestly, one of the big reasons that I love sort of gore and pornogrind is just the excessive timbres. We talked about that a little bit a few weeks ago when we covered the Torso Fuck record, which is just hyper-gorked instrumental timbres on literally everything. And sort of a similar thing happens with Hymen Holocaust. And I like the idea of taking really exotic timbres and just using them very seriously and playing it straight. You know what I mean? It's like, you can imagine, for instance, the vocals on this record being used as an effect in an extreme metal band, but you don't think about using it just constantly. But then you just do, and then sort of new idioms develop out of that. But let's listen to this song where the distorted bass, that real bulldozer mortician shit, just threatens to overwhelm everything. And there's also this really lovely dark Dorian riff in this sample that sounds like it's coming from Candlemas or Cathedral or something, and I really get a kick out of it. So, yeah, I mean, the highlight for that is obviously just that huge Doom riff, that dun, 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 dun. And then, but then with that really, like, beautiful, like, very Candlemas circa Nightfall, that dun, 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 you know, cap or wrapping it off, which he then ends up, after that's been introduced, he reincorporates that back into that main, like, chuggy stomp riff as
a more dissonant turnaround.
Yeah. So there's a lot of, like, very musician-y stuff happening on this record. It's just very simple when it comes to number of notes per riff. Yeah. But there's a lot of, you know, clever reusing of motifs and reworking them. And I think it's so cool to hear timbres as fucked up as this, but then with just these very sort of lovely, sad, nocturnal melodies popping up. I love the contrast between the sort of the thematic content and some of the musical ideas on display, which was kind of like leads back to what I was saying. It's like Pornogrind started a lot of things and did a lot of things as jokes, but then, well, what happens when you just take them really seriously and you just execute fully committed to some of these ideas? Well, you get shit that's really interesting out of it. And I think that's why I still listen to a lot of this music and just, like, dig through CDRs and tapes of this kind of thing.
That song plays almost like a fantasy version, a fantasy late 80s Doom band.
Yeah.
What can I do with Doom here? Like, there's nothing there that wouldn't fit on a doomy late 80s record, but it's like, it's centered on a Candlemas riff, and then the chug riff that brings it in and rolls it out sounds like it could have been on Into Darkness by Winter, right?
Yeah. And it's so cool. And then, but yeah, no, I guess I'm just repeating myself, but I love the idea of, I think playing with timbres is something that extreme metal should do more. We've talked about this a fair amount on the show, but every time I hear something that just sounds very exotic in the way it's produced or the way that it's executed, my ears always perk up because, I love a good old school black or death metal guitar tone or something, but there's a whole world of possibilities out there. And when we start sort of mashing them up in weird ways like this, we always talk about on the show, it expands the possibility space.
Yeah, well, we've got some more of that on this next sample. This one is this one is an ode to the recent pandemic of fake Mexican beer that killed millions. This is Corona Killed My Boner. Yeah, so the star of the show there is, again, it kind of parallels that circling tribal tom loop that started my other sample. It's this like oddly syncopated kind of hardcore thing going on, which is this triplet blasted, I guess more like, it's like a noise rock or Metallica kind of syncopated thing. It's one we're all very familiar with, right? You know, it's sort of like the Killing Joke thing, right? But but blasting it.
Yeah, it totally it takes a standard idea and totally changes the inflection of it. Because every time you've heard that kind of riff before, but the drums are always syncing up with it. Here, just cutting across it with that sort of slow blast makes it feel really fucking weird.
I think it's like 5/4, but each quarter note is subdivided into triplets or something like that.
Yeah, I was trying to like count it off properly, but I'm starting to notice that, I mean, this is like 3 samples now that have had some sort of strange polyrhythmic play on it. Like really simple time signatures, but arranged in really interesting ways.
Yeah. That's actually 2 measures. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, like, so it feels like 5/4, but stretched across 2 measures. I don't fucking know.
I'd have to listen to it more closely, but I think that's one of the things that makes this album cool, is that, like, clearly all the ingredients going into it are very simple, very deliberately spare, but he's got these little tricks of arranging them so that they come off very, you know, very sort of lopsided and off-center. There's not a lot of symmetrical stuff on this record, which I like a lot. I don't know, man. I just...
I've been outsmarted by a pornogrind record.